Hi, everybody. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'd like to thank, first of all, London Middle East Institute, Center of Iranian Studies, and Aki El-Bourzi, specifically from SOAS, for helping us put on this event. Now, this is the first in what I hope will be a series of events where we actually look at LGBTQ Iranian lives and experiences. And I think it's quite apt that it's occurring during the History Month in the UK, as important aspects of history, provenance, context, content, and time are really pertinent here. Today, we're learning about Iran, where as a nation with a gender-neutral language, discussions around the use of the term they change. Whilst ideas need redressing, linguistically, no change is required. Likewise, ideas of third and fourth genders, whilst new to Western cultures, have ancient roots in some other parts of the world. And then meanwhile, when we consider the fact that Western LGBTQ studies are only a few decades old, and importantly, highly dynamic, and that includes the language and the terminology. I'm actually saying this as a pretext and an apology on behalf of all of us taking part today in case anyone uses a term that another is in disagreement with. So please let us kindly alert each other, but let us also be aware of the cultural nuances in language and socio-religious structures that mean LGBTQ experiences are as varied as the nations that they occur in. And of course, there is the nomoculture, which is highly dynamic and is still being formulated. Now, today we are really lucky that we've got three brilliant scholars from different points of their career joining us. And I'm not going to say too much about what they're going to speak about because you're going to find out shortly. But what we've done is we are going to close the chat during the presentations of our dear friends today. And all your questions, please address in the Q&A section and kindly put the name of the person you'd like to have the question addressed to. We, unfortunately, as you're aware, especially with the numbers that we have, we may not be able to address all the questions. However, Aki is kindly putting up all the email contacts of our speakers today. At the end of each of their talks, you will get a list of their literature references, which you may find interesting. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our first speaker. Zeynep پیغمبرزاده is undertaking a PhD in sociology on untellability of Persian bisexual narratives at the University of Huddersfield in the UK. They are co-founder and board member of Spectrum, a feminist queer organization based in France, and a teaching assistant in an online Persian master's program at Iran Academia. So Zeynep Jan, if you'd like to take over, please.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us today. And I want to especially thank my research participant and activists who helped me to do this research and are present here today with us. I'm going to talk about mononormativity in the Persian-speaking LGBT communities. And by non-mononormativity, I mean the normative understanding of sexual orientation in the binary of heterosexual versus gay, which erase other sexual orientations such as bisexuality, pansexuality, polysexuality. And I'm doing this research as a bi activist because I used to, and I still do that. I encourage people to talk about their bisexuality, but I realized that it is hard to talk about bisexuality in the Persian context and also to understand it. So I tried to understand why this happened. So my main claim is that a story about sexual orientation in post-revolutionary Iran is often shaped around the idea of discovering the real gay and also realize if that person deserves to be protected. That happened because of the fact that a lot of people had to seek asylum based on their sexual orientation. And because of that, we can see that stories are told to and by different people in the field, including asylum seekers, activists who support them, their interpreters, case officers, and even when reporters and researchers talk about sexual orientation, they often have to do their research or their reports about asylum seekers because they are the most accessible group for any research about sexual orientation among Iranians. And on cyberspaces also, a lot of discussions on social media are often around the fact of supporting asylum seekers. And I decided to focus on bisexual asylum seekers as a bisexual immigrant who has had the privilege of not being forced to seek asylum. So this research is trying to fill the gap between different areas of studies, sexual orientation and gender identity studies about Iran, which has often neglected bisexuality, sexual orientation and gender identity-based asylum, which also does not consider bisexuality, bias studies, which is often only about people who live in their own country, intimate citizenship, which also does not consider immigrants and asylum seekers. And even when we talk about stateless studies, it's often about not about sexuality. And by intimate citizenship, I mean the discussion about a right to intimate part of our life. I will discuss that later. So sexual stories in the asylum process are being told and retold several times. But the main occasion that these stories are being told are when asylum seekers tell it to the case officers with the support of their allies who are other asylum seekers and also activists. So I use a framework designed by Plummer, which discuss any occasion of telling a story based on who is telling the story, with whose advice, and who is the reader, who is the audience. And based on a Plummer framework, I use a specific framework to analyze the context that stories are being told and understood. In this interactive narrative analysis approach, I analyze context in 3 different levels. In intersubjective level, I focus on language, intention, conscious and unconscious choices that people make in telling their stories. The social field, which focus on historical events, social groups, structures, and institutions in relation to identities, social networks, emotions, motivations. And in meta-narrative level, I focus on the local and universal meaning systems and concepts that are behind any storytelling. And to collect my data, I have used 2 different techniques. I have interviewed asylum seekers and activists. but I did not only interview bisexuals, but I also interviewed monosexuals. By monosexuals, I mean gay, lesbian, and heterosexual trans asylum seekers. And I made this decision not only because it is hard to find bisexual asylum seekers, but also because, as I said, stories are shaped in interaction between people, so it is important to consider all of those people who are involved in the process as stakeholders. And I will also refer to online and offline participant observation of Persian public SOGI debates that I have been involved in it both as a researcher and activist for several years. So in analyzing the asylum stories, I consider different stages of asylum. The past life of asylum seekers in Iran, the asylum process itself, their living condition in Turkey as a transitory country, and also their possible future after resettlement in a third country, which is often either US, Canada, or Australia, and more recently, some European countries, especially Spain. So by analyzing those interviews, I concluded that asylum seekers learn about SOGI from their family members, friends, health providers, and media and cyberspaces. They have joined online and offline LGBT communities, and the information that they have have been in different languages, in Persian, Turkish, and English. And even when they were not familiar enough with English, they have tried to use different strategy to be able to access that information, even sometimes using Google Translator. And they also tend to use English terminologies more than Persian ones. And they also trust English sources more than the Persian ones. They have also faced and witnessed online and offline biphobia, regardless of their own sexual orientation. So when I talk about biphobia in the community, I mean different negative attitude that people have in the community. The first one is that bisexuals are hypersexual. Ramtin, a gay man activist, says, this is a very common idea that bisexual individuals can have orgasm wherever they want. Their emotional dimensions are not considered at all. Bisexuals are also considered as cheaters. Ahura, a bi man, says, I'm always doubted and humiliated by my partner. My partner thinks that I'm in a relationship with a girl all the time, and this is very hard. And my partner does not like me to have a female friend. Another form of biphobia is that bisexuality is not seen as a sexual orientation. Shaya, a trans woman who used to identify as gay for a while, remembers, it seemed that people were divided to two groups. Some seemed to be people outside that community who were hetero, and the rest of us who used to say that we are gay. Bisexual was not a word, so we did not used to talk about it. There is also this assumption that everyone is bisexual but can choose to become straight. Saman, a heterosexual trans man, justified that idea this way. I say maybe it's because of banning sexual relationship with the opposite sex. It is banned here in Turkey as well. This is a very common stereotype in the cyberspaces as well that I will discuss it later. Another biphobic attitude is that bisexuality is just a phase. Robin, a bi man, has been told several times, you would like to have a relationship once or maximum twice. You will leave and you will seek the other one, the other sex. You don't get attached. But Robin emphasized that he can be really deeply attached to his partners. And also, bisexuals are not accepted as a part of LGBT community. Surena, a heterosexual trans woman, remembers. Bisexuals were closer to us, but not one of us. This feeling was there, but we were very comfortable with them. They were very present in our community, had an active presence, and really liked to be integrated into the society, really liked to be accepted. But what is the impact of that biphobia on bisexual people? It's by invisibility, which happens in different ways. First of all, sometimes bisexuals cannot discover their sexual orientation. Fariman, a bi+ queer person who used to identify as heterosexual trans man, says, if I knew that sexual orientation is a spectrum, maybe I would search more. Another impact of that is bisexuals cannot find a role model for themselves. Mona, a bi-cis woman, says, no one used to officialize it. I mean, I don't remember that anyone has emphasized that, for example, they are bisexual or you can be bisexual. And yeah, by cis person, I mean a person who identify with the same gender as they have been assigned at birth. And at the end, bisexuals have to hide themselves. Robin, a bi-cis man who used to introduce himself as gay, says, I used to feel that this way they will accept me more compared with a bisexual because they used to keep a distance from me. But there is another form of biphobia which is resulted directly from asylum process. Some asylum seekers claim that bisexuality has been misused by asylum seekers. Ali, a queer person, says, if we were in an open society, in a European country, where there was no ban for any sexual orientation, it wouldn't be a problem for me. But in this asylum context, bisexuality has been misused. Saman, a trans heterosexual man, also says, authorities have heard a lot of lies. Asylum seekers presented themselves in the name of bisexual, bisexual, bisexual to the extent that they ruin the situations for others. For example, many bisexual cases take longer, many are not believed, many get picked up. So my result confirmed the previous studies, which has been done based on asylum cases that I have discussed it in my book chapter that you can find online, that bisexual asylum seekers tend to be rejected more than gay and lesbian asylum seekers because bisexuals are erased from country of origin information documents, which are very important documents when asylum cases are assessed, and also because bisexual asylum seekers or their interpreters are not familiar with the terms and definitions used to describe bisexuality. And also because asylum authorities expect asylum seekers to choose between heterosexual or gay. And as a result, bisexual asylum seekers are invisible in the asylum process. The percentage of bisexual asylum seekers among the LGBT asylum seekers is very low, sometimes almost zero, because asylum activists and other asylum seekers advise them to seek asylum as gay or lesbian. As I said, I have analyzed cyberspaces as well. These cyberspaces are important to understand the context because they are the platforms that people find resources about sexual orientation and gender identity. They find other LGBTQ individuals. They can come out or tell their anonymous stories, and they can also organize for collective actions, for example, by using hashtags and cyberstorms. we can recognize two different debates in social media and also generally in LGBTQ communities. An older debate is between the concept of همجنسباز or same-sex player, which is a very offensive word, and it's often used by people who are LGBT phobic, and همجنسگرا, which is considered to be a more acceptable and respectable one, and it can be translated as a homosexual. But there is a newer debate, again by using همجنسباز or same-sex player, but this time against bisexuals or دوجنسگرا in Persian. And this is often used by gay people who claim that they are not the همجنسباز, the same-sex player, the perverted one, but bisexuals are that pervert group, and they try to defend themselves in this way. But where these concepts are coming from? Diaspora activists suggested to use همجنسگرا in a state of همجنسباز in 1994 in Huma magazine, which is considered to be the first Persian gay magazine. This happened while in many languages, activists suggested to use gay as an identity in a state of homosexual as a pathologized concept since 1960s. Defining همجنسباز in contrast to همجنسگرا can be compared with defining homosexual in contrast to pseudo-homosexual by psychologists in the global north in the middle of 20th century when they were analyzing gender-segregated contexts such as prison and military services. But why all of these discussions are important? I want to come back to the concept of intimate citizenship that I mentioned at the beginning. Intimate citizenship is about our right to choose what we want to do with our bodies, our feelings, our identities, our relationships, gender, eroticism, and representations. But bisexual citizens are excluded from discussions on intimate right because of heteronormativity, but also because of mononormativity. And it is also important to consider that LGBTQ asylum seekers' rights, including their intimate rights, are neglected in any discussion about citizenship because they are stateless. So in a broader context, in the international level, we can talk about international polarization. That on the one hand, there are civil society activists, state and media who talks about sexual right as human right. And then on the other hand, there are again, civil society activists, state and media who talks about traditional values. And both of these groups are under impact of globalization, and both of these approach and discourses are universal approaches. I want to conclude that biphobia and bi-erasure in the Persian-speaking community is under influence of biphobia in the English pop culture and media and social media because they are the resources that shape our understanding of sexual orientation. And also under impact of academic studies and human rights reports in the global north because they shape the country of origin information documents that asylum cases are assessed based on that. And the asylum process itself is very important because it forces people to perform a specific form of gayness and refuginess to be able to get asylum. In such a context, Persian bio stories are not tellable and if told are not heard, understood, and recognized. Thanks for listening.
Thank you very, very much for that. And thank you for keeping so in time, Zainab Jan. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said before, please, all your questions addressed to the person you'd like to ask it from in the Q&A. Next, we're going to move on to Bahrain Ozadi. Now, I might add here that it's because of many hours spent having listened to gender issues from Bahar that part of the reason that we've got this whole LGBTQ Iran series going on. Dr. Ozadi received her doctorate in philosophy from University of Paris, Sorbonne. She's currently part-time researcher at the Faculty of Medicine Bichat and postdoctoral fellow at the University of Paris, Sorbonne. Her postdoctoral research is on female genital mutilation in France, but a large body of her work and her PhD was on transsexual studies in Iran. Thank you, Bahar Jan. I hand over to you.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here today to present you briefly a short presentation of my research that I've done for my PhD 2 years ago on transgender identities in contemporary Iran after the Islamic Revolution of 1979. This beautiful picture was shot by my dear friend Tahmine Monzavi, in which you can see Tina, a trans woman who has passed away, unfortunately, 1 year ago in February. And in memory of our dear Tina, I wanted to put her beautiful picture here. So let me start with notions and terms. Abbreviation trans or transgender is an umbrella term covering people whose gender identity is different from the gender assigned to them at birth. Trans people may desire or not to undergo sexual reassignment surgery and medical assistance to transition. Trans people, like anyone else, could be non-binary, gender fluid, or binary, and also after transition or before transition, they can also be non-monosexual or monosexual. Most of the people that I met for my interviews identified themselves as trans, transsexual, or TS. But as you can see, there's some terms that have been translated in Farsi as sex change surgery, عمل تغییر جنسیت, sex change تغییر جنسیت, gender confirmation, تطبیق جنسیت, gender affirmation, تصدیق جنسیت, or تایید جنسیت. And as you can see, there's a changing from sex change surgery to gender affirmation. But as I said, most of the trans people that I met identified themselves simply as trans, TS, or transsexual. DSM or ICD-11 are both two important references that not only in Iran, but in all countries, that a trans person is should pass by a protocol of medical legal sexual reassignment surgery. So all of these countries are reference to a diagnostic and statistical manual of mental disorder. In Iran, we are still based to version 5 of this manual, in which the seeking of medical and surgical help is a symptom of gender dysphoria. However, we can see a very optimistic changing, for example, for WHO, that approved recently that in its global manual of diagnostic, they have put gender incongruence from the mental and behavioral disorder to a chapter named to a chapter related to conditions related to sexual health. But as I mentioned, in Iran, we are still in a DSM-5 that seeking of medical and surgical help is a symptom of gender dysphoria or malal jinsiyati or اختلال هویت جنسیتی as gender identity disorder. So my questions, arguments, and method, as my time is really brief here, I don't talk about my theoretical approach that I use in my PhD, but I was really influenced by Foucauldian approach about power, knowledge, and subject, and the discourse analysis and discourse criticism. So my method was completely qualitative analysis. I did in-depth interview with trans people, group interview, also with all institutional persons that they are engaged in this protocol of sexual reassignment surgery. I also did some online interview and observation that I will explain you later. As Afsaneh Najmabadi, as a historian, show us in her great works, the history of gender transition in Iran begins in 1940s. And in 1960s, we can see that a lot of terms like sex and gender determination, notions of gender disorder or hormonal or genetical, have been translated largely from American psychiatric literature to Iranian language. The other part is the history of Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa in 1967, when he was exiled in Najaf. And at this time in Tahrir al-Wasiya, in a series of his books, he legalized the sexual reassignment surgery for intersex people. In 1973, the first the first sex change for non-intersex people have been reported in the media. And then when Khomeini became not a leader of Islamic Republic, and he gained not only as a religious authority, but as a political authority, his fatwa gained support, finance, and force of law. So when we talk about Khomeini and his fatwa, surely we talk about Maryam Khatun Mulkara, who is a spiritual mother for trans people in Iran, who met Khomeini in person, and it was the first person that got the fatwa of Ayatollah Khomeini. Mulkara sent the letters to Khomeini, and every time Khomeini thought that she's an intersex and referred her to his fatwa. But when he saw her in Iran in 1986, it was the time that Khomeini understood what is the difference between an intersex and a trans woman like Maryam Khatun Mulkara. And as you can see in the translation of the fatwa, Khomeini said that sex reassignment surgery is not prohibited in Sharia law if reliable medical doctor recommend it. In this fatwa, there isn't any obligation for trans people to undergoing sexual reassignment surgery. However, what is a conditional and what is very important is the medical diagnostic of being trans. So the Islamic Sharia thought, institutionalized by the theocratic state of Iran, has an open perception, and we can all the time criticizing this openness. What are the principles that in this Shia thought have been taken to legalize this gender transition or this gender identification? If you are really interested, I recommend you to read the works of Alipur or the work of Kariminia, but I just put some of these principles, like for example, necessity over prohibition is a guiding principle in Islamic medical ethics. It means that when you are in a situation of hardship, this hardship is a necessity. So a trans person, because he or she suffer from this situation, is in a situation of necessity, and this person can override its prohibition. Principle of permissibility is that everything or act that isn't clearly forbidden, haram, is halal. I think it is one of the most important principles that Ayatollah Khomeini took, and because we don't find anything as haram in Sharia law, so it's halal. The principle of dominant, which is very nice principle, I find it really nice, but all the time is limited in its limitation, is that everybody had a right to or control over his or her body and property. And the transformation of adjectives and characters of creators do not change the essence of divine creation. So as I told you, in Iran, passing by a sex reassignment bureaucracy or medical legal sex change protocol is obligatory. It starts normally by a psychiatric assessment, but for other trans people told me that they process it by a judge, by an authorization of a judge in a familial court. So trans people are really between these two big institutions of psychiatric assessment, medical assessment, and the other parts is the law and what is regarding law in this country. So these processes is not as simple as you can see. Sometimes they are the years and the years in this labyrinth institutionals, and sometimes they are referred back. And what is important that in this protocol, mandatory sterilization is so very important, and not only mandatory sterilization, mandatory reconstructing sex reconstruction after the sterilization. So a trans person, as I told you, my thesis was about the subjectivities, the process of identification. A trans person, not only in Iran, I think in every country, in every society, is in a bigger layer of gender normativity. This gender normativity in some countries like Iran is highly binary, and everybody knows it. And in some other countries is less, it could be less binary, or however the voice of activism is more here. But in this gender normativity, as is produced and reproduced by religion, citizenship, love, family, school, love, job, everything. So this process of identification starts in this space. And then is institutionalization. As the work of Zara Saidzadeh shows us, and it's very interesting, that trans subject in Iran is mostly a subject of medicine. And that's why I told you that we are completely stuck in a paradigm of pathologization. Even though the sexual reassignment surgery have been legalized, but trans person, they didn't got the recognition in law. We can find other discourses in this institutionalization, like who is a real trans, who is a fake trans, who will become a proper woman and proper man. And we have also the voice of transgender activism outside and inside Iran. And all of these so influence to these identifications, and surely it is interactive. Trans person as a subject also influence to these different layers. I put some names. They are not, I didn't want to label trans people, but what I labeled is their reactions. It's their process of identification. They are sometimes disciplined, very happy and good in this binary and in this protocol proposed to them in Iran. They could be non-binary, they could be gender nomad, and they become the outsiders of this institutionalization of the request in Iran. They can be regretters, but not only regretters because they wasn't real trans, but because of for example, the quality of their surgeries, because they were forced to do surgery in a limited time of 2 years to gain their identity. We have strategies. This means that they are someone that really seek this identification, but they are the outsider of these institutions. So to shed light to these different experience and strategies, I've chosen some quotes from my research, and I will read for you. I went to Ruzbe Hospital 3 times. They tried to dissuade me from having an operation and asked me to come with my husband. I was in a very difficult situation at the time of the divorce. My husband always knew that I was not a woman like the others, so I didn't agree to their terms, but they told me that if I didn't bring it up, my case wouldn't move forward. I tried to kill myself because I couldn't take it anymore, but my kids took me to the hospital. I gave up my therapy at Ruzbe Hospital. As you can see, this trans man at age of 13 years with 2 children cannot pass this process as simple as I showed you. And he should bring his husband or his parents in his processes. So this is one of the specificities of Iranian history of transgenders. So the next quote is, I want to remove my testicles by surgery and get a lawyer to change my documents. I can also do breast prosthesis surgery to feminize my body. The important thing is to stop being a man and look more like a woman. But I know that is not possible because I left my parents and they will refuse my request. I had a hard time. I was injured by my brother. My leg have been broken. I lost our studio again. We didn't have any home. Now it's better. I do business, like, you know, the sex business. We earn our living and we keep the city alive. شهر رو آباد کردیم. So for these young trans women who have left, who don't have any parents to be there for her request. So she's an outsider. And the other question is this situation that is really vulnerable for her. She do sex working for gaining her living, so for living. But in this situation, she's completely outside of any recognition in Iran, and she's completely in a situation of precarity. And what is the becoming of this person that identifies herself as trans and she don't have any place in this protocol. So I suggest you to come back to Iran and work for us, and be careful not to become the instrument of the West. I'm telling you the truth. Iran is the paradise for trans. There are no organization or charities to really help us. Despite all these, TS can live in Iran. It's not oil that the Westerners can take away from us, but with human rights, they can influence and raise awareness in Iran. Be careful what you do and for whom you do this research, because your analysis can be used to attack and criticize Iran once again. This was one of the very interesting quotes and one of the very interesting person that I've met, because I've never heard the voice of these kinds of trans people in Iran. And I think it was really a unique voice. Masculinity, as I experience it, is different from that experienced by another man. Likewise, femininity, as you experience it, is different from the experience by another woman. I create my masculinity in my way. It's not a copy and paste of someone else, it's mine. So it's someone Zarastu quote, a trans man and actor and director of theater that I will show you his voice and an activist in Iran. I'm never going to talk about this with anyone. I have no trans friend. I only stay in touch with natural women like you. So this kind of auto-censorship is really common in trans people that I've met, not only in Iran, but also outside of Iran as asylum seekers. This form of auto-censorship and completely deleting all her past or his past is really one of the interesting points that I've met. So the last quotes, it's, I want to talk now about the form of resistance, and I try to be on time. I think that criticizing in a violent and angry way doesn't work in Iran. And this way of criticizing is even a little selfish, because you have to criticize someone who is on an equal footing with you, not someone who doesn't know the trans topic. I don't mean to say that I'm always passive and gentle. To defend myself, I also scream when necessary. People start to tolerate a trans in an atmosphere of mutual understanding and not in an argument. Some resist with anger and hatred, but it's not resistance. So for these trans women in Iran, if you want to do some resistance, it isn't the same way that we can see in other societies, in Western societies, with asking a recognition in law. It's more tolerate, because you cannot be aggressive with someone, with a society that isn't enough sensibilizing. They don't know enough what is trans and what is trans issues. So cyber activism is one of the most important place for trans people to identify themselves. This cyber activism is not only political, but by telling their stories, their everyday life is a form of resistance against this invisibilization of trans people as an identity, and only one single identity. So here is Saman Arastu, that I thank him a lot, because I learned a lot from him. Saman is an actor. He did his transition in 2007. And he was the personage, the first bodyguard as a woman in the Iranian cinema. But what he do as activist in Iran is that he proposed some kind of theater therapy. This theater therapy was first started for himself, to do a therapy for himself, and but not only for he don't just he. Sorry, his histories is her individual histories, but for other peoples that join him in his workshop. What he do as a methodology and method in his works is that he invite, for example, trans people or their parents to go on the stage and talk directly to public and talk about their everyday lives. Sometimes he use some real trans person as a personage, and this person in his theater, that there isn't any fourth wall, they go to the public and ask them to put, for example, red nail polish on hair, or put some lipsticks on her. And this is the strategies to facing people with this shame, to accepting some identities that they are not for them normal. he put scarves, for example, to men, to audience before starting of his piece, and he challenged this person to how it could be feel when you don't belong to a gender representation and you should put it in your body. Or he asked, for example, the audience to put on his breast bandage that most of trans men do. And this is maybe the final slide, and is that when one hand holds him back and bears his veil, the other hand comes to help him. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Bahar John, for your brilliant presentation. Some more than one speaker has said that the complete references that we put don't seem to come up. Please, at the end, Aki is going to put everyone's emails, as I said before, into the chat, so you're welcome to directly get in touch with our speakers. Our final speaker for today is Shekhoof Bahani. She holds an MA degree in comparative literature from the University of Amsterdam and is currently part of the Amsterdam School for Cultural Analysis, where in 2020 she started conducting her PhD research into screened, unscreened narratives, non-normative gender and sexuality in contemporary Iran. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm very happy to be here today and definitely enjoyed all the presentations. I'm just going to share my screen. So my research is titled Unscreened Narratives, Non-Normative Gender and Sexuality in Contemporary Iran, as Roya Jan said. I want to say that I'm at the very beginning of my research, and as much as I would have wanted to share more outcomes and results, unfortunately, I have to stick to my approach more. And hopefully today I can use the example of two films to show how perhaps films can be an opening for us to look at the overlaps between nationality, gender, ethnicity, and sexuality. And in my research, I look at, a number of contemporary films and performances, also the works of Salman Aristu that Bahar mentioned. And I look for representations of queerness and non-normativity. And I use this term as an umbrella term referring to what is established outside of the heterosexual, heteronormative codes within the society. And comparing and contrasting these films together with the political religious discourses that was brought up a little bit. And I try to see then what is the space for queerness in contemporary Iran, given the dialogue that somehow is beginning to start with a cinematic, artistic discourse and this political religious discourse. So when we talk about queer representations in Iranian cinema, of course, we have to remember the censorship that all films have to go through. So we end up with films that feature a trans protagonist because, of course, as explained, this identity is more recognized compared to other forms of identification. And you have these films that on a certain level, they are aligned with the dominant political religious discourses that mandate medically transitioning to the other binary sex. And at the same time, some of them, you see that they sort of criticize, they find a way to criticize the frameworks around this legalization. And these are just some of the examples that you might have come across. We also have films that are a little bit more rare, I would say, and they bring up the topic of queer desire. So you have, for example, in Invasion, and a little bit more directly, but in the Risk of Acid Rain, you have a less indirect way of talking about queer desires, queer feelings. And of course, probably it starts with Daughters of the Sun by Maryam Shahriari in the year 2000. And of course, there are other films that I have not included because it's a short time, but mostly there are series, TV series and films that sometimes, contribute to the stigmatization when it comes to queer and trans individuals rather than criticize. So I haven't included those, but if we want to talk about it in the Q&A, it would be great. So the films that I do want to talk about today are Offside and Cold Sweat, specifically because they revolve around the issue of football and the stadiums. So just to kind of maybe remind you if you have watched them, or tell you if you haven't watched them, Cold Sweat tells the story of one particular female protagonist, the captain of the Iranian football team, the female football team. It's a fiction film, Afrouz Ardestani, who wants to leave the country and go and attend an international match, but she can't because her husband has basically disallowed her from leaving the country. And this, of course, rings a bell to so many of us. Many Iranian athletes have been in her shoes. An example is Nilufar Erdalan. And on the other hand, we have Offside that tells the story of not the football players, but the football fans who, of course, because of the ban imposed on female sports spectatorship, cannot go to the stadium and have to do that as disguised as men, like many women do. And I'm sure the stories are familiar. And so on the surface, again, these two films, one of them criticizes the passport law, and the other one criticizes the ban. And I'd like to show how perhaps they can do a little bit more than these criticisms. So I mentioned that I chose them because they revolve around football and stadiums. And of course, that's important because stadiums and football, they're political spaces, political sports. That's where the national identity begins to exist and be reflected and created. And when we look at the case of Iran, if you can see the photo, I don't know how clear it is, you can see names of the 12 imams, you can see religious symbolism, and this is the Ozadi Stadium, and that's Khamenei giving an hour-long speech to the Basij force. So this image gives an idea of why stadiums are important, but also they're important because executions happen in stadiums. In smaller cities, executions happen. And at the same time, of course, together with the gender segregation that I talked about, the stadium kind of represents and reflects this paternalistic, patriarchal, male-dominated and violent space. It's interesting also to know that it also reflects some other issues, such as the marginalization of different ethnicities. For example, in the year 2018, there was a match between Persepolis from Tehran and Traktörsazi from Tabriz. And what happened was that the number of seats allocated to the fans of Traktörsazi were fewer than those allocated to the fans of Persepolis. And so this kind of already reflects the marginalization of this ethnic group, but also that it started a conflict, right? The fans of Traktörsazi started to cross the boundary and to occupy the same number of seats and sort of be entitled to the same safety and the same space. So basically, the whole point is that the stadiums are key to establishing this Persian Shi'i identity. And so I want to just draw on the work of Ali Ansari here, who writes in his book titled The Politics of Nationalism in Modern Iran. He writes that this form of nationalism, the Persian Shi'i nationalism, is not a new nationalism after the revolution. It is merely a reinterpretation of the nationalism that already existed before the revolution. But now it's with a focus on the key role of the clergy in building this national sentiment. And so there are some overlaps then, right, between the Persian Shi'i nationalism and the nationalism that has been there since the modernization process during the Pahlavi era. And those overlaps, again, can be mentioned, the Persian centrism, right? What is also key in both forms of nationalism and has been extending before the revolution and after the revolution is the meaning and the symbolism of the female body, how it has been politicized back then by practices of deveiling, and after the revolution by the mandatory hijab. So I just want you to have all this in your mind before we go to the films. So basically, the questions that I'd like to address, the questions I think these films can help us think about, because I think we don't think about these questions as much when we talk about LGBT issues, is that what are the overlaps between these experiences, the experiences of non-normative individuals and people from non-Persian communities. And so to go to the first film, so I told you that in Cold Sweat, we have Afrouz Ardestani who wants to leave the country. She has already this national sentiment of going and playing for her country, but she can't because of the passport law. So sub-article 3 of Article 18 and Article 19 basically mandates for a married woman to have a written permission from her husband, to apply and get an Iranian passport. But also Article 19 gives a permission to the husband to withdraw that initial permission at any time that he wants. So basically, a married woman cannot rely on her passport because at any given moment it can be taken away from her. And this is exactly what happens in the case of Afrouz. So I want to just point out one thing that is very interesting about Cold Sweat, that from the start, the film gives us two opposite teams, almost like football itself. You have two characters who identify or embody the Persian Shi'i nationalism, which we talked about with the entanglement of Shi'ism, religiosity, and the Persian centrism. And you have two other characters, Afrouz herself and a team member, Masi, who stand in opposition to this Persian Shi'i nationalism. So those who embody this nationalism, the nationalism of the state, are one of the characters you actually see in figure 1, the one who is wearing a black chador, who is the supervisor of the team called Mehrane, and the other one you see here, this is Afrouz's husband, Yasser. So these two sort of get closer together when the film gets a little bit further. And the reason why is that they discover that Afrouz hasn't been living with Yasser, with her husband, for over a year, and instead she's been living with Masi, her team member, her teammate, and possibly partner. So this realization basically takes away the opportunity from Afrouz to ask the federation to support her, because this is possible, that the football federation sends her as a national athlete rather than the husband take her captive as a married woman. But it doesn't happen because the two are aligned with this Persian Shi'i nationalism. And as much as she tries and she gives in to all the requirements, it doesn't happen. And by all the requirements, I want to draw your attention to the figure 2 here. She is asked to basically go back to her husband and give in to his requests and have sex in order to persuade him to give this permission. And as you see here, she is in the kitchen, a domesticated environment, and he is gazing upon her within that, social role and gender norm. And this is basically before he, again, denies that right from her. So I want you to remember this kind of dynamic as we go to Offside. And Offside is interesting because it was shot during the match that was taking place at the Ozadi Stadium in 2006, a World Cup qualifying match. So pretty important. And at the same time, there were open stadium campaign advocates outside of the stadium. So it's a very socially relevant film. And what happens here, that again, you have authority figures against a protagonist. But what's interesting is that this authority figure is a little bit different from the authority figure that we had there, because with Afrouz and Mehraneh here, both of them are Persian-speaking women. And then here you have a guard, a soldier who is from Azerbaijan, who is from Tabriz, with a group of female protagonists, unidentified, unlabeled. They can be queer women, they can be bi and so on. So the dynamic here is interesting because now this authority figure is male, but he's not Persian speaking. And this changes the power relationship between the two characters. They start off as being sort of opposite of each other. One is captive, the other one is policing them, and then they talk and realize that they share some experiences, and the shared experience is exactly because of the patriarchy and the Persian centrism within this national space. If the protagonist played by Shaiste Irani, she decides to, challenge the gender norms and gender roles as she has done by, ignoring the ban and entering the stadium, then she is seen as a traitor like Afrouz. She is seen as someone who is no longer part of this national space. And if the soldier from Azerbaijan wants to not submit to this Persian centrism, he is seen as a separationist. He is seen, again, as someone who does not belong to this national space. So I want to just draw your attention to this shot here, which happens sort of after this connection is made between these two characters. And you'll see the soldier from Azerbaijan looking at these women with an X, again, because unidentified. And as they are rejoicing after Iran has scored a goal, even though he doesn't feel that sense of identification with Iran, and we realize in the film that he identifies more with the city he comes from rather than Iran, he sort of connects with them, and he starts to sympathize and understand their struggles and their lives. And it's interesting to see this, I think, in contradiction with Cold Sweat, when this is an objectifying gaze in a domesticated environment. This is a newly discovered gaze, which has a lot of potential, I would say. But then, reaching my my conclusion here, I have to maybe comment on that potential a little bit. The film Offside ends on I would say, on an idealistic note. If you've watched it, it's it's an amazing shot of everyone being in the bus. They are being taken to the police station, but they're also listening to the football match on the radio. And what happens is that suddenly Iran wins the match. And again, this is shot at this on the same day. So the street gets busy, the bus has to stop, and then everyone, has to leave. There is no one cares about anyone's gender, anyone's sexuality. It's this kind of opaque moment, more or less, when the soldier from Azerbaijan and the protagonist are all part of this nation, as you can see in the photo. But this moment is fragile. We realize this moment is not something that happens often or is predictable. And on the other hand, we have Cold Sweat ending with Afrouz being alone in her car. She has lost her job. She has lost her partner. She has lost her house too. But yet she doesn't give up completely. She calls a live program and comments again on her situation, as she had done before, and speaks up about her situation. So even though the two films kind of end again with on different notes, but one thing they have in common, and that is that this struggle hasn't ended, and the protagonists don't give up at the end, no matter how hard it is. And this is the note I want to end this with, that the struggle goes on. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very, very much, guys. You managed to squeeze in a lot into a very short time, which brings me to another point, dear viewers. As we said, this is just a taster. Personally, I would have liked to have heard far more from our speakers. So in due course, hopefully we'll have them come and speak to us a bit more. And also, we've already lined up the second event for the LGBTQ Iran, with an amazing speaker talking about classical Persian literature and the different characters that were non-gender normative, non-sexual normative, the terminology people use. And so hopefully you'll join us for that. Now, meanwhile, I can see quite a few questions have come in. So I'm going to just go through them one by one as they arrived, everyone. Actually, I'll go backwards. For a start, Paolo Rivetti says, thank you very much, Shekhoof, very inspiring. Barajan, Malcolm Rakshan asks, have the effects of Khomeini's fatwa extended beyond the borders of Iran and into the broader and the global scope of Shia jurisprudence, consciousness in spaces like Lebanon and Iraq?
Thank you for this question. I think if you're really interested in this part, it means Sharia law and fiqh, I really recommend you the work of Alipur that I mentioned also, or the work of other researcher. But in my, as I know, the fatwa of Khomeini was at the same time of the fatwa of Al-Tantawi in Egypt. And what have happened for Iran, it was really, I think it was really interesting, but to really answering your question, I should be more knowing about what happens in Shia thought and what are really the difference. But I think that in Lebanon, in 2016, they have, with the request of one trans man, they have kind of legalizing this request for sexual reassignment surgery. But all the time, I think in Lebanon, also in Iraq, the question of trans people is completely psychiatric, in a psychiatric assessment, and you should surely pass by a mandatory sterilization and sexual reconstruction. I think is one of the most important. It means that in a Muslim country, you cannot change your identity, your gender identity, without deleting the adjectives that it's in your body as male or female. You should so do a sterilization and then reconstruct your body in completely in a binary form. So this is my information about your question, but I think that the fatwa of Khomeini was surely influenced to other mujtahid or other religious authorities in Shia thought. But as I mentioned every time, this is a fatwa especially for Iranian society. And it's this kind of, I think it's really, it's not a Shia thought, it's not Islam in a big perception, is really little and little and little and very specializing.
Wonderful, thank you for that, Bahar Jan. Now I'm gonna go backwards, and it's amazing, there's different questions coming in. I'm gonna go on to a question that was asked from Zainab. Zainab Jan, how do you think new changes to internet censorship are likely to affect the LGBTQ community in Iran?
Yeah, I think censorship has been almost always there, and people have always found their way to express themselves and to access information. After so many years of using different anti-filter softwares and VPNs, people already know how to go around it, and I think it's not a big issue for people, but they are more concerned about their security because people have been arrested for what they have been doing on social media. It has not been limited to LGBT community, but also to other people who don't follow the norms, including sexual norms. So I'm more concerned about how it will impact on everyday life of people, but also people know how to protect their identity, how to hide themselves. So I think people know how to live in this kind of context.
Thank you very much. Baharajan, there's another question for you about self-misidentification. People who might find it easier or more convenient to identify as transsexual, even though they might not be, but they only have a hard time adjusting in a society as a feminine man, for example, without necessarily having gender dysphoria. So misidentification, Baharajan, how does one?
Okay, self-misidentification or self-misrecognition. Yes, it's yes, it can happen in Iranian society, like anywhere else, in any other, in every society, that a trans person should pass by a protocol, by a medical legal protocol, maybe, or surely in countries that homosexuality is criminalizing and any other gender identity as non-binary is criminalizing. So these kinds of misrecognition or self-misidentification can happen. But if I want to be more specialized, talking about Iranian society, if a trans person identify him or herself as trans, but he's not, what could be convenient for this person? Okay, he or she can go to this protocol and if successfully can pass the hours of therapy and diagnostic, and she's diagnostic as TS or trans, she just have 2 years. And then she should undergoing sexual reassignment surgery. So if this person really find this situation and it's complete violence against her real identity, I think it's not as easy as we think that she can pass this protocol. What I didn't have time to talk about is that when we talk in outside Iran, there is a very cliche image about trans people in Iran, because they are Muslims, because they are in a Republic Islamic, and because homosexuality is criminalizing. So all trans people are people that they are gay or lesbians, that they are going to, they are undergoing sexual reassignment surgery by force. And this kind of, I think in this imagination about trans people, it's really invisibilizing. We don't see a real trans that, like anywhere else in the world, can really want to change her body or want to go to this protocol. And inside Iran, we find another discourses, which is also victimizing and also invisibilizing. It means that in Iran, we just have one and only one trans identity. And this person is surely in binary and surely suffer from this situation and surely wish to undergoing sexual reassignment surgery and surely want to reconstruct sexual organ. But we have a lot of different identities that these identities are completely outsiders of Iranian protocol. So yes, it can happen, but I don't think that this person can find really this, because if I compare my research from other academicians, for example, Afsaneh Najmabadi and other researcher, it was really interesting that in Iran, based on this fatwa, you can have the authority for sexual reassignment surgery, and it wasn't limited. You have this authority. Once you have this authority, you can live in an opposite gender. And then, for example, after 5 years, 6 years, you can undergo sexual reassignment surgery. But recently, when I did my research, it's just 2 years. It means that if you don't change your body in 2 years, it's finished and you should restart. And I think this changing is because of the influence of Western medias. Western medias that they produce a lot this image of Iranian trans person that they are obligatory did this sexual reassignment surgery. I think one of the effect of all of these documentaries that show just one and only one identity as a trans in Iran is that they react to them because they want to show that no, it's not as easy as you think, that everybody can be trans in Iran. So this is my answer to your question.
Thank you very much, Baharajan. Shekhoof Jan, there's a question for you. Do you, in your research, also look at films that are mostly made outside of Iran that seem to be quite marketable and produce a particular image of queer and trans people in Iran by tapping into who nationalist discourses? How do you put the films that you discuss in conversation with the ones that that Sima Shahzadi has mentioned?
Yeah, this is a very interesting and important question that I had to ask myself at the beginning of my research. And I kind of made the conscious choice of not really going deep into the films, fiction films, and also, of course, documentaries that have been produced outside of Iran, because I feel there is a gap or there is a lack of, academic sources when it comes to films that have been produced in Iran. And what I noticed is this increase in Iranian films within Iran since the early 2000s, as I mentioned. And at the same time, there was this increase in the number of sources by Kariminia and others on the political religious discourses. So my interest is really bringing this or sort of shedding light on this interaction. But of course, as part of the wider discourse, these Iranian films inside Iran also interact with the films outside of the country. I would say that there is a wide range of films outside of the country. You have films like Circumstance, which for me personally was really difficult to watch. I don't know if you've watched it, with a lot of, it imagines a world that is not real, and, a different Iran kind of, and it has this Western gaze of what two Iranian lesbians are supposed to look like. You have other films like I Am Nasrina, for example, which I think is interesting because it looks at specifically the case of two asylum seekers, Iranian asylum seekers. But yeah, it's a wide range of films. It would be difficult to categorize them. And definitely I would somehow write something on those films as well, but I wouldn't be able to go deeper into that. I hope that answers the question.
Guys, we've got Asal Bahari asking everybody, so we'll go in terms of Bahar, Shekhoof, Zainab. Do you know how the cinema and theater or TV shows in Iran show the evolution of LGBTQ? The cinema, theater, and TV, how we can see an evolution of LGBTQ in Iran. So should we start with Bahar Jan and then go
to... I think Shekhoof can better than me talk about this subject, but as I talk about Saman Arastu, and I don't know if he's here and if he can join us. What Saman did in theater and in his performance, I think Saman is the only person that talk about not only trans people, but all other non-binary, non-heterosexual people in his pieces. But as trans people and transgender identities legalized in Iran, and as he himself is trans, so he challenged people about this question. And I think in cinema, I'm not really specializing, and I let Shekhoof to answer you. But in theater, I think someone tried a lot to inform people about by question. It means as an opening question about transgender situation in Iran, he opens a lot of other questions to public, like, for example, how to facing this shame when he asks public and audience to put nails on a man's body. It's a sense of shame, to facing your shameness about this representation and this diversity. So I let Shekhoof to continue.
Yeah, I also want to mention that my focus, I'm not a film critic as well. I do cultural analysis, so I look at these films as cultural objects. But to comment maybe from my personal observation with the films that have been coming up, I can tell that there is more representation, but then again, what kind of representation is it? I've been thinking of this one film. Probably some of you know it. It's a new film, but I forgot the title. But there is a protagonist, and she says she's a trans. Trans protagonist, and he basically says that I am sick. I need sex reassignment surgery, and so there is this. I would say. There is different ways of bringing up this topic, but there are always those representations that add to the stigmatization and that have trans characters, in a way reduce the trans character to someone who just wears clothes assigned to the other binary gender and so on. So I think it's not a how do you say, it's not a linear kind of evolution as it's represented in the films. You always have films that go a little bit deeper, try to criticize a little bit more, and films that just stay in the surface.
Zainab Jan, have you got anything to say about films?
Well, I'm not an expert when it comes to movies, but I think something that is important to consider, not only about films in Iran, but also any cultural products anywhere else, is that one thing is that how characters are represented, and one other thing is that how we interpret them as audiences and also as critics. And I think it's very important to consider when we see same-sex attraction, it doesn't necessarily means that we are seeing a gay or lesbian character, especially when we have seen that character who has been in love with the other sex as well. So it is very common to say that for example, this character who is living with this woman is, and she identifies as a woman as well, is a lesbian, and then think that, okay, she has been forced to marry that man, or she has never been interested in that man, and or she has been trying to live like heterosexual people. And because in Iran we never really directly can talk about same-sex sexual attraction in cinema, then of course we never know how the characters identify, but we have the same problem in cinema in Hollywood, for example. We often see people who are engaged in sex with more than one sex or character, one sex or gender, but we almost never hear the word bisexual, pansexual, or queer. We always assume that anyone who is with their same sex are lesbian and gay.
If I may here interject, because I've been doing some studies on Iranian film music, so I've been watching films for the past 60 years. And one thing I noticed prior to the revolution, I don't know if people are aware, but in Iran, we have something called the luti, these sort of men who were the big men of the city. And there are real gay narratives within that. And I found that the characters that I would encounter in these films would be, the gay characters would be rather effeminate gay characters, sort of men who are slightly effeminate, but there was a real sense that there was something gay going on within this storyline. We were never shown it. And then I find that as I watch films post 1979, and especially after the 2000s, you are actually getting more nuanced characters. It's never out in the open, but there are far more characters that could be associated with the LGBT community in a bit more rounded way. Before, it really was the luti, downtown Iranian macho man who had a male counterpart who was always effeminate. Now, a question I have here from from Najd Al-Ali, from all of you. Thank you for everyone for very interesting interventions. I wonder how you straddle the difficult challenge of advocating for LGBTQ issues and rights in relation to Iran and the Iranian diaspora in context of the extremely precarious political situation in terms of sanctions and the threat of war. It came up just once in a quote by Bahar, but I assume, Najd Ali says, it's relevant to all of you. So what does an intersectional political position mean for you, and how you maneuver the highly polarized Iranian diaspora? We'll start with you, Zainab Jan, because it's on you.
Yeah, this is very important. As I mentioned, the international context has a huge impact on the way that we think and talk about sexual orientation. And also more specifically in the context of asylum, it's very important the way that case officers, often from Western countries, expect asylum seekers to behave based on their stereotypes that they have about who is a real gay, and that real gay is a middle class a white man who has a specific open lifestyle and go to specific places. This is very important, and also it's very important how in diaspora a lot of activists think that they can choose what should be the priority of everyone, and often minority rights is silenced because of the what is considered to be the more important political issues, that people are encouraged to stay silent and don't criticize because West can misuse it, or Iranian regime can misuse it, that women are not supposed to talk about hijab because it disturbs the way that Western media talk about Iran, or I don't know, that same-sex sexual conduct is not as important as issue of political prisoners. This makes talking about minority issue very hard because we are not considered as important as men, especially from dominant ethnicity, who are talking about the most important political issues.
Okay. Bahar Jan, have you got anything to say about this whole?
I think Shekhoof answered very well, but these stereotypes, as I told you, I face it a lot. It means that when I was in Iran for my research, every person that I met in institutions told me, why you do this research? You are not in Iran. You are doing this research for whom? For which organization? It means that I'm as a researcher, I'm there and I want to stole the information of trans people or Iranian as a national information to them to hear. And here I faced also other peoples that they wanted me to more and more politicize my question and to be more as a political activist instead of as a sociologist or as a researcher. And it was really interesting for me. And these quotes that I think another person also mentioned in questions that directly asked me, it means that when I started the interview with this person, that was really unique because she was really happy to be in Iran and she was really grateful to Ayatollah Khomeini's fatwa. And I've never heard the voice of this person. Because I said uniqueness because I've never heard in documentaries, in books, in works, in research, the voice of these kinds of trans people that they are in Iran. And she asked me, why you do this research? You shouldn't do it because you are not in Iran. And it was really interesting for me, and it shows that how the politics outside Iran, the discourses outside of Iran about trans subject is really in a stereotype forms. Iranian Islamic trans person, what could it be? And directly they put the criminalization of homosexuality. And this is that's why I put pressure to that. These are both the discourse that invisibilize this multiple form of identification and subjectification in Iranian society. And it was a challenge for me to be neutral, to be to do my research as a researcher and to critique, and even if it's political, I critique it, and to not be only as an activist who just critique the system and the discourse, but what trans people also believes and they share with us.
That's really good, actually, because that in a roundabout way answers a question of Shandi's about this idea of the unique voice. Shekhoof Bahani, have you got anything to say about this political situation and how it impacts your studies?
Yeah, just a quick comment, because of course my research is less less dependent on actual individuals and more working with the films. But I still find it challenging to find platforms. I mean, this is a great opportunity but usually the platforms or the opportunity given to us oftentimes are, you know, as mentioned, we were put in a situation where we have to use a lot of disclaimers. This is not what I'm saying. This is not what I'm saying, because there is so many stereotypes and so many prejudgments that first all your effort goes to kind of undoing that, and then maybe you get to bring up a certain topic. And yeah, again, I agree with Zainab and Bahar that this isn't a topic, it's not a lecture topic. We're talking about actual human beings who, you know, come from a particular ethnicities, social classes, and all these films represent those characters that are visible to some extent. But there are queer individuals, there are working class women and trans men who are, as Zainab said, you know, it's untellable stories really. So we're dealing with an unjust system. We're dealing with this fight for changing things, not only for queer people, but changing things for the better.
Wonderful. This is an interesting question, because this whole idea, we started off with the idea of language and nomoculture and the problems we have in translating different concepts to different countries with their own notions. Persian Disciple asks, as a non-binary person, I haven't found a satisfying word for non-binary in my native language, Farsi. So our three researchers, have you got any suggestions for such a term? Have we even found such a term? So should we start with you, Shekhoof Bahani, and then we'll go to Zainab and Bahar?
I think Zainab and Bahar.
Yeah. Okay, so should we take Zainab and Bahar? To Zainab John, Aval, have you come up with it? Have you come across a term?
Well, as a non-binary person, I use جنسیت غیر دوگانه, which is like direct translation. And some people have already used that for almost 2 years now. And some people are not happy with that, and still they use non-binary, because as I said, people tend to use English terminologies in the Persian speaking LGBT communities. For example, I was told by my interviewees that they have never met anyone who used دوجنسگرا. They always say bisexual. And I think people don't learn, my research also shows that people don't learn terminologies and concepts from Persian speaking activists like us. They learn it directly from English pop culture and also English social media. And it's one of the reasons that they are not interested to use the Persian words that we create for ourselves, and we fight over it. And always we challenge each other if they are good translation or not. We are the only one who are concerned about these translations.
And Bahar John, anything to say on the matter?
No, I think it's complete. غیر دوگانه, جنسیت غیر دوگانه.
Wonderful. Now, guys, I think this is a really interesting question. How do your researchers feed into the whole feminist debate in contemporary Iran? Are there any specific contestations that transpire? And that's from Sabiha Aloush. So we'll start with Bahar, then we'll go Zainab Shekhoof. Go on, Bahar.
Unfortunately, what I can say that in Iran, the feminist discourses in Iran, they don't talk about trans people, and there isn't any. Maybe I'm wrong. You can't correct me, but I didn't find any feminists in Iran that talk about trans people, that criticize their issues, their situation, and they add them, not just add them because they are not there to add other peoples as women, but they don't talk about, for example, the issues that a trans woman facing in everyday lives. I didn't find anything inside feminism in Iran, and outside feminism, there is a different form of feminism. Some feminists are radical feminists, and all the time, for example, that I talk about trans women as women, and I add them to my presentation when I'm talking about women for 8th of March or other days, they criticize me. But some feminists are more open, and they add so the issues of trans people also in their discourses. But generally, I think that what is the difference that we can find in Iranian society comparing other societies that have a very great progress, it was because of feminists that really criticizing these pathological discourses about trans people. But in Iran, unfortunately, I didn't find really too much working in the discourses.
Okay, Zainab Jan, anything feminist thoughts? How it's affected?
Well, that's a very important issue, and I think we need to talk about it more in Persian speaking communities. I actually talked about it in an annual feminist conference, which is mostly for diaspora activists, but also some activists from Iran managed to join it every year. That in Iran, it is very hard to talk about sexual orientation and even gender identity in feminist movement because of the pressure from the government, and also because of the stereotypes that society has. But even abroad, feminist activists who have lived here for several decades, they still don't talk about these issues that much. They still talk about gender and sex in the binary of men and women. They still don't think about sexual orientation that much. They don't even educate themselves to be able to talk about it correctly. They don't really care about it. But there are also activists who identify as queer activists, or in their intersectional understanding of feminism, they consider sexual orientation and gender identity. And also inside the LGBTQ movement, there are people who self-identify as feminists, and they understand how feminism is important in their fight for equality based on sexual orientation and gender identity, not only among people who identify as women or non-binary, but also among people who identify as men, as gay, bisexual men, or trans men. So I think we can have hope for the future, but at the moment, this is an issue that has not been taken into account that much.
Thank you for that. Shekhoof Jan, anything to add?
I agree completely. I just want to mention that I think what Bahar explained, this, the legalization of sex reassignment surgery in Iran is itself important for, women's rights issues related to that context, because of course that legalization has happened within this mapping of gender and sexuality. So it becomes interesting when you go a little bit deeper and you see, for example, if a heterosexual couple, both of them transition and they have a kid, which one becomes the father legally? And I think, if I'm not mistaken, Bahar, correct me if I'm wrong, but legally the trans woman is still the father of the child. While the trans man, who was the mother, doesn't have the same authority. And I think that says something about, this paternal, the whole family structure and the importance of being a father and that authority. But so issues like this, I think, can be really, really essential to both kinds of research, but I don't see that in the research community that I'm in touch with, unfortunately.
Thank you for that. I was informed just now there's been a brilliant play written by Sanaz Bayan called Blue Pink about trans experiences in Iran. I found a very interesting question about the COI, because I think we should use some of this technical knowledge we have here. Zainab Jan, how do you think that the COI available to asylum caseworkers adequately reflect the situation that LGBTQ and people face in Iran, with enough detail enabling the caseworker to take the right decision? So how do you think the situation is, the COI?
First of all, I think it's important to consider that no country of origin information document can ever be complete because these are only documents that are produced either by human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch or by embassies and other governmental and non-governmental organizations. And even if they get updated regularly, even if they consider different gender identity and sexual orientation, that they don't do that, they still are only documents. And no one can really assess anyone's else sexual orientation and gender identity, especially when they are from another context, especially when they are in a context like asylum. Hold the idea of checking if someone is telling the truth or not in the asylum process is not really acceptable and should be challenged. But it's important to see that all the country of origin information documents are mostly about gay men. They rarely consider other groups of people in the LGBTQ communities. Doesn't matter by whom they have been produced or for which country, there is almost never anything about bisexuals in those documents.
Okay. We have a question here from Valley. Salam Valley John. Bahar, and it's a question for everyone, but thanks to everyone, he says, for the great presentations. Bahar, how do you differentiate self-identification, where individual human beings identify and express themselves in particular and individual ways, and the paradigm of rights issues, legal rights, state-sanctioned violence, or state-sanctioned recognition and protection of the rights and well-being of the individuals and groups by law? So how do we make these two meet?
I think, as I mentioned in my work, there is surely self-identification. It's not something coming from the person as a subject without influence of anything else. There is discourses, there is religious discourse, love, family, love, everything. And this was in the layers that I show you in gender normativity. So not as trans or not trans, we are all constructed in these processes of what we can see. It's interactive. It's interactive, and it's not just outside of us that create this self-identification. I think it's both sides. And if your question is that how in this situation that other discourses like love, like anything that is in society is important for a trans person, that I said as a self-identification, I think that gender transition starts by a self-identification. When a trans person is still a child, she or he starts to affirm this identification that he or she feels, and it's in face of her family or his family, and then a school, and then bigger and bigger and bigger. And all the time, this is a process. So identity, for in my thought and from the philosophical thoughts that I'm inspired by, identity is all the time a process. And one part, as Ricoeur says, it's a idem, as we can find in a word of identity, is idem. It means the same. So we are the same parents, we are the color of our eyes, that it will stay one thing forever, but it's the other parts of identity that is in perpetual, if I say it like that in English, I don't know, but in French, we said in perpetual construction. And identity is all the time in a process of construction. So all the time, I think all the discourses is important, but trans people, they are not, we can find an agency in Iranian trans people. It means that they are not all the time forced to identify themselves as trans, because I showed you it is not as easy as we can imagine. But surely there are some form of invisibilization, and there are some trans people that they become the outsiders of this protocol, for example, in Iran. So for me, identity and self-identification is a process, and all the time in an interactive way between subject and society.
Now, one thing, Aki John, someone Arastu has actually put their hand up. I wonder if there's any way that we can bring someone into the panel. Please, can we check into that? Because someone is a very important character within Iran. So, yep, thank you, Aki John. So, someone, you're going to be coming online soon, I believe. We should take, I wonder where someone is. Oh, there we go. Saman Jan, هستین شما؟
سلام، بله هستم.
به خوش آمدین. سامان جان، به انگلیسی میتونین صحبت کنین یا فارسی و براتون ترجمه کنین؟
متاسفم انگلیسیم خوب نیست.
خیلی خوش آمدین. This is Saman Arastu, who Bahrain Ozadi spoke about. He's one of the most important trans characters within Iran, whose presence is very important. سامان جان، چیز خاصی داری برای ما امروز بگین؟
بله، من خیلی الکن متوجه صحبت‌های بچه‌ها شدم. سلام میکنم به شکوفه عزیز و بهار عزیز و زینب عزیز و شما که این برنامه رو به پا کردید. مرسی. میخواستم بگم که تئاتر، سینما و تلویزیون ما برای خوشایند گروهی کار میکنن، نه برای هنر و نه برای مردم. عرق سرد که شکوفه در مورد صحبت کردی، آفساید، نه تنها به هموسکسوال ها توجه نمیکنه یا به جنسیت ها، بلکه خود سینماش جنسیت زده است و بیشتر مرد سالاری در این دو فیلم حاکمه. میخواستم بگم که کالبوچه کافی که من کار کردم، که بهار و شکوفه صحبت کردن، در مورد ترنس های هموسکسوال و ترنس های بایسکشوال هم صحبت شد. این بابت زینب جان بود که گفت که خیلی کم در مورد اینها صحبت میشه، ولی ما یه جورای سانسور رو دور میزنیم و به قول معروف حرف بچه ها رو به زبان ساده به مردم میرسونیم.
دستشون درد نکنه. So someone kindly told us that basically he thanked all the speakers, everybody for being here. He said that the theater, cinema and television of Iran is for the good of some. It is not for the purpose of art and for the, largely speaking, everybody, the people. It's not for the peoples, it's just for khoshayandagi, it's just for the benefit of a few. Now, he also mentioned that the films that Shekhoof Bahani showed, The Cold Sweat and Offside, there were no, I will use his terms, he used the term homosexual, but I presume the word gay is preferable here. There are no gay representations in the cinema. Whilst the cinema of Iran is highly gender-ridden, it is much more of a patriarchal society. So in both these films, we see this male patriarchal society at play. And he also mentioned that the theater that he does, Kalbucha Kafi, about the trans, have within it gay trans and bisexual trans. And their idea is to get the story across to people in the simplest manner, in the language that everybody understands. خیلی مرسی. سامان جان، چیز دیگه ای میخواین شما بگین؟
مرسی. من امیدوارم که هنر بدون مرز کارش رو انجام بده و جدا از خط قرمزها جلو بره، مثل دورانی که گودار در سانسور کار کرد و صداش رو به همه رسوند. میشه توی سانسور هم خیلی خوب حرف رو زد، به شرط اینکه دغدغه سامسون جدید و سفرهای آنچنانی و فرش قرمز نداشته باشیم.
He's saying that let us have an art without borders to be able to reach beyond the red lines, like the time of Goddard, where within censorship one could still make art felt. سامان جان امیدوارم که به مرور زمان شما یه برنامه برای ما حاضر کنیم که بتونیم چه این LGBTQ ایران ما داشته باشیم. امیدوارم بتونیم یه همراهی با هم داشته باشیم.
حتما خیلی خوشحال میشم. مرسی، ممنون. خداحافظی میکنم با همتون.
Merci, Samanjan. Oh, what an honor to have had someone here with us. And hopefully in due course, someone is going to provide some content for our program in due course. Khobacha, we have got 5 more minutes left. I don't know, because I just want to make sure that everyone knows, please forgive us if we weren't able to ask your questions. There's another question for everybody. And I like this question because this has always been of interest to me, because within Iran, many people know we have this societal thing of Andaruni, Biruni, and we've had all this sort of, as very quite rightly Malcolm Rakshan points out, we have a lot of homosocial intimacies, which are very pronounced in the country. And I think ideas of homosexuality really came to us from the Western canon of ideas. In Persia and in the East, we do have different ideas about third genders and so forth. So, Bacha, the final question is, do you believe that the homosocial intimacies, which are pronounced and identifiable in Iranian society, have impacted or complicated queer imagery, narrative, and semiotics in cultural and aesthetic discourses? So Bahrajan, we'll start with you. آره ببین داره میگه که این هی به هم مرد و همه زن و با هم ور میرفتن، آیا اثری گذاشته؟
Yes, I understood the question. Yeah. But I think the homo erotism is part of queerness. Why they should? I didn't understand the question exactly. I mean that I think the effect shouldn't be negative, or it's inside queerness and inside how this person identify him or herself, and without talking about the terms. I don't know, maybe Zainab can answer better than me, or Shekhoof. But I don't find any difficulties for queerness, or for I think it's a part of this, and these terms I like these terms as homoeroticism, because it's not in a modernization form of science and psychiatric, and it's really outside of all of these discourses.
I think that the thing here was homosocial intimacies, because of the Islamic world's separation of male and female. We have had sort of a long history of certain events happening between men and between women. He's saying this earlier idea or way of being in our country, in Persia, does that complicate issues, or for you, no? It's part and parcel of the whole thing.
I think that this idea about Iran or other Muslim countries, that there is a very huge sexual segregation between people, is one of the very famous idea about people, but I don't think that it can really create the identity of a person. It can, and it's not only for Iran. I think even in outside of Iran, this form of relations between two sex can happen in the same, for someone can be just in some years of, for example, when they're a child or in adolescence, and then they can change, but it's not an identity. I don't believe that this identity is, as I told is the process, and it's in an interactive ways. I don't think that can determine an identity of person or sexual orientation of person, this context.
Okay, Zainab John, Shekhoof John, have you guys got anything to add about this homosexuality and how that affects the studies?
Well, I think same-sex sexual attraction has been existed in different societies. It's not something unique about Iran or Middle East. But we all know that pathologization of same-sex sexual conduct is a modern new discourse from 19th centuries. And as I said, it has been adopted in Iran as well. So there has been criminalization of same-sex sexual conduct even before the Islamic Revolution in Iran. And that was an idea that was adopted from Western countries. And also the idea of being able to claim to cure someone for their same-sex sexual attraction has been existed in Iran before the revolution as well. So I think we have adopted a specific form of homophobia and biphobia and LGBT phobia from Western countries, and also the idea of the binary understanding of binary understanding of sexual orientation is also a new modern concept. Thinking that everyone have to choose and be attracted only to one sex or gender. These are new things. And I'm sure that you all know how nationalist, modernists reacted to these discourses and tried to modernize society by encouraging people and also forcing people to be only with the gender that is considered to be the opposite sex or gender. And still people have negative attitude towards same-sex sexual conduct because of that modernist nationalist discourse. These are important things to consider when we talk about our history and when we talk about sexual orientation and the impact of Western discourses in understanding sexual orientation.
Brilliant. Shekhoof Jan, have you got anything to add? Okay. So ladies and gentlemen, that draws us to a close. And in a way, this whole thing about homosocial intimacies is a brilliant segue to our next program, because we will have a really amazing specialist talking about classical Persian literature and the presence of characters outside the non-binary gender sexual normative ideas. I hope you've enjoyed today, and I hope that we get to have more talks like this, because for me, I got into all of this, having got to know a little bit about the Iranian and Islamic LGBTQ. I've begun to realize how complex the issues are and how the conversation needs to increase. So please, you have all of our emails. Get in touch with me if you have any ideas, any books, any plays, anything that needs to be discussed under this umbrella term. So thank you very much to our speakers. Thanks a lot, guys. And I hope to have you guys back to do proper talks, proper full-length talks. And Akijan, is there anything to add, or are we done for today? Yes, I think it's all good. He's written, oh God. Yes, God. Bachaha, enjoy the day. Thank you, everyone, for sticking with us for such a long time. And we'll wave a goodbye to everyone. Merci, merci, Hamegi. Merci, merci. Thank you. So, Akijan, if you close the session. Thank you, guys. Thank you, everyone.